There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the simple weight of another person's head against your shoulder. You don't recognize them as watershed moments at the time. There's no clap of thunder, no dramatic music. There is only the subtle, almost imperceptible shift of a tectonic plate deep beneath the surface of your reality. For me, that shift felt like the surrender of bone and muscle, the final, trusting release of consciousness as Ethan's breathing deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep against the column of my neck. We were on my worn-out sofa, the one with the slight dip on the left cushion where I always sat, and the city was a distant, muted roar outside my apartment window. The only light came from a single street lamp 3 floors below, casting long, distorted shadows across the room, turning familiar objects into foreign sculptures. In that dim, amber light, with the immense and terrifying weight of his trust settled upon me, I knew, with a certainty that was as quiet and profound as his slumber, that the architecture of my life was being irrevocably altered. A door I had long kept locked and bolted within myself was not being forced open, but was instead being gently, patiently, and perhaps unknowingly, coaxed ajar. It's strange, the cartography of memory. The beginning, for us, was not that night on the couch. That was merely the first tremor after the fault line had been established years earlier. The real beginning was a place of transit, a non-place, a concrete platform under the harsh, fluorescent glare of a train station. I was 22, returning to the city after a weekend visiting my parents, a trip that always left me feeling hollowed out, as if I'd spent 2 days performing a version of myself that was slightly out of focus. I was a photographer, or at least, I was trying to be. My portfolio was thin, my bank account was thinner, and my world was viewed primarily through the aperture of a 35mm lens, a habit that kept me at a safe and manageable distance from actually participating in it. I saw life in frames, in compositions of light and shadow, in fleeting expressions that I longed to capture and preserve. That day, my camera bag was heavy on my shoulder, a familiar, reassuring weight. The station was a cacophony of rolling suitcases, garbled announcements, and the collective sigh of 100 tired journeys. I was just another anonymous figure in the river of people, content in my invisibility. And then I saw him. He wasn't doing anything remarkable. He was standing near a pillar, staring up at the departures board with a look of mild, almost comical frustration. He had a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and was wearing a ridiculously bright blue jacket that seemed to defy the grimy, utilitarian aesthetic of the station. It was the color of a mountain lake on a perfect summer day, an impossible, joyful blue. He ran a hand through his dark hair, and the gesture was so full of unself-conscious exasperation that it was magnetic. In a sea of muted grays and blacks, he was a slash of primary color. My photographers, I was drawn to him instantly. He was a story, the frustrated traveler, the man in the bright blue coat. But then he turned his head slightly, and his gaze, sweeping across the crowd, snagged on mine for no longer than a single, stuttering heartbeat. It wasn't a look of invitation, or even of particular interest. It was just a glance, a brief, accidental collision of awareness. But in that fraction of a second, I felt a jolt, a flicker of recognition so profound it felt like remembering a dream I didn't know I'd had. His eyes were a warm, clear brown, and for that one instant, the noise of the station faded into a dull hum. The world compressed into the space between us. Then he looked away, back at the board, the connection broken. But the image was already fixed in my mind, developed and printed in the darkroom of my memory. I didn't know his name. I didn't know his destination. I only knew that the sight of him had stirred something in the quiet, dusty rooms of my interior world. It was the same feeling I got when I knew, absolutely, that I had captured a perfect shot, a feeling of rightness, of a moment seized from the relentless flow of time. I boarded my train a few minutes later, found a window seat, and watched the city begin to slide past. I expected the memory of the man in the blue jacket to fade as all the other fleeting city moments did, Another interesting face filed away. But it didn't. The image of him, frustrated and vibrant, stayed with me. It was 2 years later, at a mutual friend's crowded housewarming party, that I saw him again. He was standing by the makeshift bar, laughing at something someone had said. He wasn't wearing the blue jacket, but I knew him instantly. The way he stood, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the particular energy he seemed to radiate. Our friend, Mark, saw me staring. "Oh, you don't know Ethan, do you?" "Liam, this is Ethan." "Ethan, Liam." He reached out a hand, his grip firm and warm. "Hey man, good to meet you." His voice was exactly as I hadn't known I'd imagined it. Warm, with a low, easy resonance. And his eyes, up close, held the same startling clarity I remembered from the train station. "I feel like I know you from somewhere," he said, frowning slightly. My heart did a slow, painful somersault in my chest. "I don't think so," I said, my own voice sounding thin and distant. It was a lie, a small, reflexive act of self-preservation. Admitting that I had mentally cataloged him for 2 years based on a 1-second glance in a train station felt like a confession of a far too intimate crime. He accepted it with a shrug, and we fell into the easy, superficial conversation of new acquaintances. I learned that he was a consultant, a job that seemed to involve a lot of travel and spreadsheets he described with a self-deprecating humor. He learned that I was a photographer, and to my surprise, he asked to see my work, not with the polite disinterest I was used to, but with a genuine curiosity that made me feel, for the first time in a long time, seen. That night was the beginning of the foundation. Our friendship wasn't a sudden, dramatic construction. It was built slowly, brick by brick, conversation by conversation. We discovered a shared love for old movies, a mutual disdain for cilantro, and an identical, almost pathological need to be 10 minutes early for everything. Ethan was the outgoing one, the one who pulled me into social situations I would have otherwise avoided, who introduced me to people with a proud, proprietary air, as if I were a fascinating discovery he'd made. I was the quiet one, the anchor, the person he called after a grueling week of travel, his voice frayed with exhaustion, just to talk about nothing at all. I became his stable ground, and he became my window to a world outside my viewfinder. And all the while, the secret I was keeping sat like a smooth, heavy stone in my pocket. My feelings for him weren't a dramatic, all-consuming fire. They were more like a pilot light, a small, steady, blue flame that was always there, warming me from the inside. I learned to live with it, to navigate around it. I built my friendship with him on the solid ground next to the chasm of what I actually felt. I became an expert in the art of platonic affection. I learned the precise duration a hug could last before it crossed a line. I mastered the casual arm on the shoulder, the friendly punch to the arm. I listened to him talk about his dates, about the women he was seeing, most notably Sarah, a smart, funny lawyer he dated seriously for over a year. I would sit there, nursing a beer, nodding and offering advice, and each word was a small act of self-immolation. My chest would feel tight, a dull ache spreading through my ribs, but I would smile, and I would be the good friend, the best friend. Because the friendship was a gift, a beautiful, intricate structure I couldn't bear to jeopardize. The thought of confessing, of seeing his kindness curdle into pity or discomfort, was a fear so vast it was paralyzing. So I kept my silence. I locked that door and threw away the key, content to live in the rooms I was allowed to occupy. The room of friendship, the room of confidant, the room of the steadfast, uncomplicated buddy. It was a good life. It was enough. I told myself it was enough. The catalyst, when it came, was not a dramatic explosion but a quiet, sad implosion. It was Ethan's breakup with Sarah. It wasn't acrimonious. There was no shouting or throwing of plates. It was, in Ethan's words, a death by 1,000 sensible conversations. They were good on paper, they cared for each other, but the fundamental spark just wasn't there. They were heading in different directions, they wanted different things, all the sad, reasonable cliches that are true. He called me the night they made it official. He didn't sound devastated, just empty. His voice was flat, hollowed out. "It's over," he said, and the words hung in the air between our phones. With Sarah, oh man, I said, my own voice inadequate. I'm so sorry. Are you okay? There was a long pause, and I could hear the sound of his breathing, the faint static of the connection. I don't know what I am, he finally said. I think I'm just tired. Really, really tired. Do you want me to come over? I asked, already reaching for my keys. No, he said, too quickly. No, I don't want to be alone, but I don't want to talk about it. Does that make any sense? It made perfect sense to me. It was a feeling I knew intimately. The desire for presence without the pressure of performance. Come here, I said, the words leaving my mouth before I had fully processed them. My couch is terrible, but the whiskey is decent. We can put on Blade Runner and not say a single word. Another pause, this one shorter, less heavy. I heard him take a deep breath. Okay, he whispered. Yeah, okay. An hour later he was at my door, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The usual bright energy that surrounded him was gone, replaced by a quiet, weary stillness. He wasn't wearing his armor of easy confidence. He was just Ethan, raw and sad and tired. He gave me a weak, grateful smile and walked past me into the apartment as if he'd done it 1,000 times. He dropped his bag by the door, toed off his shoes, and collapsed onto the sofa. I poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handed one to him, and put the movie on, just as I'd promised. We sat in the dark, the familiar dystopian cityscape flickering on the screen, the synthetic score filling the space between us. We didn't talk. The silence wasn't awkward, it was functional. It was a blanket. He drank his whiskey slowly, his eyes fixed on the screen but not really seeing it. I watched him in my peripheral vision, my heart a dull, aching drum in my chest. I felt a profound, almost painful wave of tenderness wash over me. I wanted to fix it, to say the right thing, to somehow absorb his sadness into myself. But I knew I couldn't. All I could offer was this: a safe room, a shared silence, a silent presence. Near the end of the film, during the famous Tears in Rain monologue, I saw his shoulders begin to shake. He didn't make a sound, but I could see the silent tremors, the desperate fight for control. He brought his glass to his lips with a hand that wasn't quite steady. And then, without a word, he set the glass down, curled his legs up onto the cushion, and leaned his head against the arm of the sofa, facing away from me. It was a clear signal. I am breaking, but please, do not look. I respected it. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, my entire body humming with the force of my restraint. I wanted so badly to reach out, to put a hand on his back, but I knew it would be a trespass. The credits rolled. The screen went black. The only sound was the hum of the electronics and the sound of Ethan's tightly controlled breathing. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, a sentinel in the dark. Eventually, his breathing evened out. The tension seemed to seep out of his body, leaving him limp against the cushions. I thought he was asleep. I was about to get up, to find a blanket to put over him, when he spoke, his voice thick and muffled by the upholstery. Is it okay if I just crash here tonight? On the couch. My own breath caught in my throat. Yeah, I said, my voice rough. Of course, Ethan. Stay as long as you need, he didn't reply. I waited another few minutes before quietly getting up. I pulled the thick wool blanket from the back of my armchair and gently draped it over him. His back was to me, but I saw his hand reach out from under the blanket and grip the edge of it, pulling it tighter. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. It was an acceptance of care. I went to my bedroom, leaving the door ajar, as I always did. I lay in my own bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sound of another person breathing in my living room. It was the beginning of the ritual. I didn't know it then, but that night, a new pattern had been set. The ordinary Tuesday had revealed its true face. The ground had shifted, and I was standing on the edge of a new, terrifying, and beautiful landscape. That first night bled into a second, and then a third. The pretext of the breakup remained, a convenient and plausible excuse that we both tacitly agreed not to question. Ethan would text me late in the afternoon, a casual, "Hey, you around tonight?" And I would always reply, "Yeah." Doors unlocked, he would arrive after work, shed his consultant skin of a suit jacket and tie, and sink into the familiar landscape of my apartment. We developed a routine, a quiet domesticity that existed only within the four walls of my home. Sometimes we would talk, his initial raw grief slowly giving way to a more thoughtful melancholy as he processed the end of his relationship. He would talk about Sarah with a sad fondness, dissecting what went wrong with a logical precision that I knew was his way of coping, of putting feelings into neat, manageable boxes. I would listen, offering what little wisdom I had, my heart performing its familiar, painful acrobatics. Other nights, we wouldn't talk at all. We would exist in a comfortable, shared silence, me editing photos on my laptop, him reading, or just staring into space. The silence was never empty. It was filled with a low, humming current of unspoken things, a sense of shared space that was more intimate than any conversation. The couch became the centerpiece of this new arrangement. It was our island. After a week or so, the pretense of him sleeping curled up at one end and me sitting in the armchair until he fell asleep dissolved. It happened naturally, without discussion. We were watching some old black and white film, and the apartment was cold. I had the wool blanket spread over my legs, and he was sitting beside me, shivering slightly. Without thinking, I lifted the edge of the blanket. An offering. He looked at me for a second, his eyes unreadable in the flickering light from the television, and then he slid over, his side pressing lightly against mine as he pulled his share of the blanket over his lap. My entire nervous system lit up. I was hyper-aware of the warmth of his thigh next to mine, the way the fabric of his jeans was a different texture from my own. I tried to focus on the movie, but the dialogue turned to white noise. My entire consciousness was centered on that thin, charged line of contact between us. I could feel the rhythm of his breathing, a slow, steady tide against my ribs. That was the night he first fell asleep on me. It wasn't the dramatic, head-on-the-shoulder moment from my memory of that first night. It was a slower, more insidious surrender. He had leaned back against the cushions, and as sleep began to claim him, his head lolled to the side, coming to rest not on my shoulder, but against my upper arm. It was a small, almost insignificant weight, but it felt like an anchor pinning me to the spot. I sat there for hours, my arm going numb, a pins and needles sensation crawling up to my shoulder, but I didn't move. I couldn't. To move would be to disturb the fragile peace of this new world we were building. It would be to acknowledge that his head on my arm was not just the incidental contact of two friends sharing a small space, but something more. Something I wanted so desperately that the fear of it was a physical taste in my mouth, like metal. He had made my body a place of rest, and I was terrified of being found unworthy of the trust it implied. This ritual became our new normal. 2 or 3 nights a week, my couch became his bed. The physical space between us on that couch began to shrink, the buffer zone of cushions and air eroding with each passing evening. The casual contact became less casual. His hand would be resting on the cushion between us, and my own hand, as if with a mind of its own, would find itself just a centimeter away, the ambient warmth between our skin a tangible force. One night, deep into our second month of this unspoken arrangement, he shifted in his sleep, and his arm fell across my stomach. It was a dead weight, heavy and warm and undeniably there. I froze, my breath catching in my lungs. My mind, my over-analytic, photographer's mind, went into overdrive. I dissected the moment from every possible angle. It was an accident. He was asleep. He didn't know what he was doing. It meant nothing. But my body, my treacherous, honest body, responded differently. A deep, profound sense of calm settled over me. The space beneath his arm felt like the safest place in the world. It felt like coming home. I lay there under the weight of his arm, watching the dust motes dance in the slivers of moonlight cutting through the blinds, and I felt a sense of hope so fierce and bright it almost scared me. I started to see the world through the lens of this new intimacy. My apartment, once just a place I lived, became a sanctuary, a container for this fragile, unnameable thing between us. I found myself cleaning it more often, buying food I knew he liked, making sure the good whiskey was always stocked. My life began to unconsciously reorient itself around his presence. I was developing a photograph in real time, but the image was emerging so slowly, so subtly, that I was terrified I was imagining it. Was I just projecting my own desperate longing onto his grief and exhaustion? Was I seeing a love story in what was, for him, just the kindness of a friend? The ambiguity was a constant, low-grade torture. He gave no sign that he was aware of the electricity that I felt humming in the air between us. In the daylight, we were the same as we had always been. We'd get coffee, he'd tease me about my pretentious taste in music, I'd make fun of his corporate jargon. The easy camaraderie was still there, a solid, reassuring structure. But as evening fell, a different mood would settle over us. A quietness, a sense of anticipation. The air would become thicker, charged with the knowledge of the intimacy to come, the shared space on the couch, the inevitable, accidental on purpose maybe contact. The door to my bedroom became a powerful symbol in this silent play. I always left it ajar. It was a statement, a testament to the platonic nature of our arrangement. See, this is my space, that is yours. We are separate. I imagined a line drawn on the floor, an invisible boundary he was welcome to approach but not to cross. But the open door was also an invitation. It said, I am not hiding from you. I am here. Some nights, after he had fallen asleep on the couch, I would lie in my bed and stare at the slice of the living room visible through the gap, at the soft light and the shape of him under the blanket. I felt like a watchman, a guardian of his sleep. The loneliness of my own large, empty bed was more acute on those nights than it had ever been before. It felt like an indictment. The ritual was both a balm and a wound. It brought him closer to me than I had ever dreamed possible, and yet the unspokenness of it all, the plausible deniability he maintained, kept him impossibly far away. I was living in a state of sustained, exquisite tension. I was a wire-pulled taut, humming with a note that was part hope, part despair. I was so afraid of making a sound, of vibrating too much, of snapping. Because if I snapped, I knew I would lose not only the dream of what could be, but the reality of the friendship that was my entire world. So I held my breath. And I waited. The crossing happened on a rainy Thursday in November. The city was weeping, slick sheets of water sliding down my apartment windows, blurring the lights into impressionistic streaks of color. The sound of the rain was a constant, soothing percussion against the glass, enclosing us even more tightly in our bubble. Ethan had had a particularly brutal week. A big project at work had gone sideways, and he'd spent 3 days in back-to-back meetings trying to salvage it. He arrived at my door looking like a ghost, his face pale and drawn, dark circles like bruises under his eyes. He didn't even speak, just handed me a damp bag of takeout Thai food and walked to the couch, collapsing into it as if his bones had turned to liquid. We ate in near silence, the only sounds the clinking of our forks and the drumming of the rain. The food was a small anchor to normalcy in the sea of his exhaustion. After we ate, he didn't even suggest a movie. He just curled up on his side of the couch, pulling the familiar wool blanket up to his chin. I sat on my end, my laptop open but untouched on the coffee table, pretending to read articles online. The quiet in the room was different that night. It wasn't the comfortable, companionable silence we had cultivated. It was heavy, weighted with his fatigue and something else I couldn't name. An hour passed. I thought he was asleep, but then he shifted, turning to lie on his back, his eyes open and staring at the ceiling. The faint light from the street lamp outside caught the moisture in his eyes. He looked utterly lost. "Liam," he said, his voice quiet, barely more than a whisper. "Yeah." I whispered back, as if a normal tone would shatter the fragile atmosphere. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see the muscles in his jaw working. He was building up to something, and a cold wave of anxiety washed over me. This was it. He was going to say it was time for him to stop crashing here, that he was feeling better now, that he was imposing. He was going to thank me for my kindness and retreat back to his own life, and our strange, intimate ritual would be over. I braced myself for the impact, for the polite severing. "I'm so tired," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. I'm so tired of everything. It wasn't what I expected. It was simpler and infinitely more vulnerable. The professional armor, the social grace, the self-deprecating humor, it had all crumbled away, leaving just this. A raw, honest confession of exhaustion. I know, I said softly. And I did. I knew what it was to be bone-weary, to feel like you were carrying a weight that was too heavy for your own skeleton. He turned his head on the cushion to look at me. His eyes, even in the dim light, were incredibly clear, and they were fixed on mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. The air between us grew thick and charged, the familiar humming current suddenly a roaring torrent. All the unspoken questions, all the nights of ambiguous touches and shared silences, seemed to gather in the space between our faces. The world narrowed to his gaze, to the slight parting of his lips, to the almost imperceptible tremor in his hand where it rested on the blanket. He was no longer on his side of the couch. In his slow, quiet turn, he had moved into the no-man's land between us. He was closer than he had ever been when he was awake and aware. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This was the moment. The wire was vibrating. I could feel it. I could stay perfectly still and let the moment pass, let it dissipate back into the safety of ambiguity. I could make a joke, or ask him if he wanted some water, and we could retreat to our established roles. Or I could do nothing. I could just meet his gaze and wait. I chose to wait. I held his gaze, and in my stillness, I gave him an answer. I gave him permission. I was not going to run. I was not going to deflect. I was here, on this side of the precipice, with him. He seemed to understand. A flicker of something, relief, fear, resolve, passed through his eyes. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his movements slow, deliberate, as if moving through water. The blanket slid away, forgotten. He was leaning over me now, his face just inches from mine. I could feel the warmth of his breath, smell the faint, clean scent of his skin and the lingering aroma of the rain on his jacket. He didn't lunge. He didn't grab me. He just hovered there, in that space of ultimate vulnerability, and he asked the question that changed everything. Would it be okay? He whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Liam, would it be okay if I kissed you? The question was a gift. It wasn't an assumption or a demand. It was a plea for consent, an acknowledgement of the line we were about to cross, and a final, respectful offering of an escape route. He was giving me the choice. He was giving me all the power. And in that moment, all the fear I had been carrying for years, the fear of ruining our friendship, the fear of misreading everything, it all just dissolved. It was replaced by a wave of certainty so powerful, it was like a physical force, a tide pulling me forward. I didn't trust my voice, so I just nodded. A single, small, jerky movement. It was enough. He closed the remaining distance between us with an agonizing slowness. His lips met mine not with passion, but with a tentative, searching gentleness. It was a question in itself. It was soft and hesitant and unbelievably sweet. It was not the kiss of a conqueror, but of a pilgrim arriving at a long-sought shrine. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and whiskey and years of unspoken things. I brought my hand up, not to his neck or his back, but to his cheek, my thumb stroking the slight roughness of his stubble. The contact seemed to ground him, and the pressure of his mouth deepened slightly, a sigh of release, of homecoming. It lasted for only a few seconds, but it contained a novel's worth of emotion. It was a confession, an apology, a beginning. When he pulled back, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. We stayed like that, breathing the same air, our heartbeats a chaotic, unsynchronized duet in the quiet room. Okay, he breathed out, a single, shaky word. Okay, I whispered back. The line had been crossed. The unspoken had been given a voice, a physical form. The ground beneath my feet was gone, and I didn't know where we would land. But for the first time, as I felt the steady pressure of his forehead against mine, I realized I wasn't falling. We were floating. Together. The aftermath was not the seamless transition into a new reality that I might have fantasized about. The morning after the kiss felt like waking up in a foreign country where I didn't speak the language. The air was thin and strange. When I came out of my bedroom, Ethan was already awake, sitting on the edge of the couch, his back to me. He was dressed, his shoes were on, and his bag was packed by the door. The sight sent a shard of ice through my chest. It was a posture of retreat, of imminent flight. The sanctuary we had built felt suddenly fragile, its walls made of glass. He didn't seem to hear me enter the room. He was just staring at his hands, which were clasped tightly between his knees. The easy domesticity of the past few months had evaporated, replaced by a tense, brittle silence that was the opposite of our comfortable quiet. "Ethan," I said, and my voice sounded unnaturally loud. He flinched, his head snapping up. He looked at me, and his eyes were full of a panicked, hunted expression I had never seen before. It was the look of someone who had woken up from a dream to find themselves in a place they didn't recognize and didn't know how to navigate. The clarity and vulnerability from the night before were gone, replaced by a thick fog of confusion and fear. "Hey," he said, his voice strained. I have to go. Early meeting. I should have left already." It was a clumsy, obvious lie. It was Saturday. "Oh," I said, the single word feeling small and pathetic in the cavernous silence. I stood in the doorway of my kitchen, my hands feeling useless at my sides. I wanted to walk over to him, to sit beside him, to touch his arm and ask him what was wrong. But there was an invisible wall between us now, a shimmering barrier of awkwardness and fear that hadn't been there before. He had built it in the hours since I'd fallen asleep. He stood up abruptly, avoiding my eyes. "Thanks for everything, Liam. I'll call you." He grabbed his bag and was out the door before I could form another word. The click of the lock behind him was a sound of shocking finality. I stood there in my living room, the space still holding the faint scent of him, the indent on the couch cushion a testament to his presence. But he was gone. The warmth had vanished, and the room was just a room again, cold and empty. I felt a profound, hollow ache spread through me. It wasn't just disappointment. It was a deep, sickening fear. The fear that I had been right all along, that it was all a mistake, that his moment of vulnerability was just that, a moment, and in the harsh light of day, he was horrified by what he had done. I had allowed myself to hope. I had let the walls down, and now I was standing in the rubble, exposed and alone. The next few days were a special kind of hell. My apartment, once a refuge, felt like a crime scene. Every object was a reminder. The couch, the wool blanket, the whiskey glasses. I tried to work, to lose myself in the familiar process of editing photos, but my focus was shot. Every face on my screen seemed to look back at me with pity. I replayed the kiss over and over in my head, analyzing it with a forensic desperation. The gentleness, the hesitation, his whispered question. It had felt so real, so honest. How could I have misinterpreted something so profound? Or was I the fool for believing that a single kiss could undo years of established friendship and, presumably, his own identity? I was spiraling, caught in a vortex of self-doubt and recrimination. He didn't call. My phone remained silent, a sleek black brick of indifference on my counter. Each time it lit up with a notification for anything else, my heart would leap with a pathetic, conditioned hope, only to crash back down. The silence was worse than an angry confrontation. It was an erasure. It was him trying to pretend it never happened. By the fourth day, the fear had begun to curdle into a slow-burning anger. It was an anger born of hurt. It wasn't just about the kiss. It was about the intimacy he had sought, the trust he had cultivated. He had made my home his sanctuary. He had taken my comfort, my silence, my care, and now that he had crossed a line he couldn't handle, he was treating me like a shameful secret. He had made me complicit in his confusion, and then he had abandoned me in the middle of it. I decided I couldn't live in the silence anymore. The ambiguity that I had once found so torturously beautiful was now just poison. I needed to know. Even if the answer was the one I dreaded, I needed to hear it. I needed to cauterize the wound. So I called him. It rang once, twice, 3 times, each ring stretching my nerves thinner. I was about to hang up when he answered. "Hello." His voice was cautious, guarded. "It's me," I said, my own voice tight. "We need to talk, Ethan. There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. Liam, I'm really busy right now. No. I cut him off, a sharpness in my tone that surprised even me. No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to come into my life, into my home, and turn everything upside down, and then just disappear. You owe me more than that. I deserve more than that. There was a long, static-filled silence. I could hear him breathing, a ragged sound. Where are you? He finally asked, his voice resigned. I'm at my apartment, I said. Where else would I be? I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, and hung up. The 20 minutes I waited were among the longest of my life. I paced my small living room, a caged animal. I rehearsed speeches in my head, swinging between righteous anger and a desperate plea for understanding. By the time the buzzer rang, my hands were shaking. I let him in without a word. He looked terrible. He was wearing the same clothes I'd seen him in 2 days ago. His hair was a mess, and the exhaustion that had been there before the kiss had now been compounded by a layer of frantic anxiety. He walked into the middle of the room and stood there, not looking at me, not looking at anything. What do you want me to say, Liam? He said, his voice flat. I want you to say the truth, I said, my voice trembling slightly despite my resolve. Whatever it is, just stop hiding. What was that? What was Thursday night? And what is this? This running away? He finally looked at me, and his face was a mask of conflict and misery. I don't know, he said, and it was a cry of genuine, painful confusion. I don't know what I'm doing. I kissed you, and it felt right. More right than anything has felt in a very long time. And that scares the hell out of me. He ran a hand through his hair, the familiar gesture now fraught with desperation. My whole life, I've had a map. You go to school, you get a job, you meet a nice girl, you get married. That's the map. I was following the map. With Sarah, I was following the map. But it felt empty. And then, with you, just sitting on this couch, not even talking, it felt full. It felt like I was finally in the right place. But it's not on the map, Liam. None of this is on the map. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for me to understand. I kissed you, and for a second, I felt like I was home. And then I woke up the next morning, and I was terrified. What does this mean? Who am I if this is what I want? I didn't know how to face you. I didn't know how to be that person from the night before in the daylight. So I ran. It was cowardly, and it was shitty, and I am so sorry. All the anger drained out of me, replaced by a vast, aching sympathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting a fundamental shift in his own understanding of himself. He wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid of what his feelings for me meant. I had been so wrapped up in my own fear of losing our friendship that I hadn't fully considered the immensity of what he was facing. My feelings for him were a quiet, long-held truth in my life. For him, they were a sudden, seismic revelation that threatened to tear up the very map he'd been using to navigate his world. I closed the distance between us, my movements as slow and deliberate as his had been on the night of the kiss. I stopped in front of him, and, taking a huge leap of faith, I reached out and took his hands. They were ice cold. Hey, I said softly, forcing him to meet my eyes. Look at me. There is no map. We're all just making it up as we go along. We're all just trying to find a place that feels like home. I squeezed his hands. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. You don't have to label it. You just have to stop running. My voice dropped to a near whisper. Just stay. A single tear tracked its way down his cheek, then another. He didn't bother to wipe them away. He just stood there, holding my hands, and nodded, a convulsive, jerky movement. Okay, he choked out. Okay. The wall between us crumbled. The tension didn't vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer the brittle, sharp-edged tension of avoidance, but the deep, resonant tension of two people holding something incredibly fragile and precious, terrified of dropping it. We stood there in the middle of my living room for a long time, holding hands, in a silence that was more honest and more intimate than anything we had ever shared. It wasn't a solution. It was a truce. It was an agreement to face the terrifying, unmapped territory together. The resolution wasn't a singular event, but a slow, quiet process of rebuilding. After our confrontation, the panic in Ethan receded, replaced by a tentative, fragile openness. He didn't leave. He stayed that night, but the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. There was no pretense. When evening came, I didn't retreat to my bedroom, and he didn't curl up on the far side of the couch. We sat together, the wool blanket once again shared between us, but this time it felt different. It wasn't a buffer or a happy accident. It was an intentional act of sharing warmth. There was a new shyness between us, a hyper-awareness that was both awkward and incredibly tender. Every small movement was freighted with meaning. When his hand brushed mine as he reached for his glass, we both froze for a second, a silent acknowledgement passing between our eyes before he completed the motion. The air was still thick with uncertainty, but it was a shared uncertainty now, not a solitary one. That night, when sleep began to pull at him, he didn't just drift off against my arm. He looked at me, his eyes soft and questioning in the dim light. "Is it?" he started, then stopped, searching for the words. "Can I?" He gestured vaguely with his head toward my shoulder. My heart swelled with a feeling so warm and full it was almost painful. He was asking. He was still asking. He was not taking anything for granted. "Yeah," I said, my voice thick. Always, he let out a breath he seemed to have been holding all day and settled his head against my shoulder, a deliberate, conscious act of trust. I wrapped my arm around him, pulling him closer, and this time, it was not the gesture of a friend offering passive comfort. It was an embrace. It was a claim. I rested my cheek against the top of his head, breathing in the scent of his hair, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. We weren't just on the couch anymore. We were building a new kind of home, right here in the space between us. The couch ritual continued, but it evolved. The plausible deniability was gone, stripped away by honesty. The touches became intentional. A hand on my knee while we watched a movie, his fingers idly tracing the seams of my jeans. My hand finding his as he slept, our fingers lacing together in a silent, unconscious conversation. We were learning a new language, a vocabulary of touch that said all the things we were still too hesitant to speak aloud. We were mapping the new territory, one gentle gesture at a time. The conversations changed, too. He started talking not just about his past, but about his future, and for the first time, he used the word we when he spoke of it. "We should go to that little Italian place you like next week. We need to see that new exhibit at the gallery, small things." But they were anchors, mooring his life to mine in small, significant ways. A few weeks after our confrontation, another threshold was quietly crossed. We had fallen asleep on the couch, tangled together in a way that had become our new normal. I woke up in the middle of the night, cold and stiff, my neck at an impossible angle. Ethan was breathing deeply beside me, his arm slung possessively over my waist. I carefully extricated myself, intending to get a drink of water, but as I stood up, the thought of returning to the cramped, uncomfortable couch felt absurd. The thought of going to my own large, empty bed while he slept here felt even more so. I stood there, looking from my bedroom door, still ajar, out of habit to him. The symbolism of that door, once so important, now seemed ridiculous. It was a boundary for a reality we no longer inhabited. I walked over to him and gently shook his shoulder. "Ethan," I whispered. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open, clouded with sleep. "Come on," I said softly. "Let's go to bed." He didn't question it. He didn't seem surprised. He just nodded, a sleepy, trusting smile gracing his lips. He let me pull him to his feet, and he followed me, stumbling slightly, into my bedroom. He collapsed onto the side of the bed I never used, and was asleep again before I had even pulled the covers over him. I slid in beside him, turned off the lamp, and lay there in the dark, listening to the steady sound of his breathing right next to my ear. The empty space in my bed, the loneliness I had felt so acutely for so long, was finally, blessedly, filled. I closed my own door. We were on the same side of it now. From that night on, the couch became just a piece of furniture again. My bed was our bed. The mornings were the best part. Waking up to the sight of him next to me, his face soft in the morning light, was a quiet, daily miracle. We would make coffee together in a comfortable, practiced silence, our bodies moving around each other in the small kitchen with an easy, familiar grace. The grand, Terrifying questions of who are we and what does this mean seemed to fade in the face of these small, domestic rituals. We were two people who made coffee together in the morning. We were two people who shared a bed. We were two people who found comfort in each other's presence. The labels didn't seem to matter as much as the reality. The reality was his hand finding mine as we walked down the street. The reality was the way he'd look at me from across a crowded room, a small, secret smile just for me. The reality was the profound, unshakable feeling of rightness whenever he was near. The man in the bright blue jacket at the train station felt like a character from a different story, a different lifetime. And yet, the line from him to the man sleeping beside me was direct and unbroken. That single, fleeting glance had been the planting of a seed. Our friendship was the years of patient watering. His heartbreak was the unexpected storm that forced the seed to sprout. Our nights on the couch were the slow, painstaking growth toward the light. The kiss was the first, terrifying blossom. And this quiet, sun-drenched morning in my kitchen, the smell of coffee in the air and his warm presence beside me. This was the flower in full, breathtaking bloom. It wasn't a loud or dramatic love story. It was a quiet one, built in the silences, spoken in whispers and gentle touches. It was a photograph that had taken years to develop, but the image that finally emerged was clearer, richer, and more beautiful than I ever could have imagined. We never really had a big, defining conversation where we labeled what we were. We didn't need to. The understanding existed in the space between us, in the way he started keeping a toothbrush in my bathroom, the way I cleared out a drawer for him in my dresser without being asked. Our commitment wasn't spoken in vows. It was lived in these small, mundane acts of making space for each other. We learned to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together. The world outside, with its maps and its expectations, still existed, but it felt distant, its noise muted. We had created our own territory, our own language, our own definition of home. And in the quiet certainty of a hand held in the dark, of a head resting on a familiar shoulder, we found that we didn't need a map after all. We just needed each other.